My name is Steve Schwartz. I run the LSAT blog. I also host the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. I've been teaching the LSAT for over 10 years now. My LSAT journey actually started nearly 15 years ago now at this point, believe it or not. So I've been at this for a while. This is my passion. This is what I do. And I love it. I think the LSAT is much more complex than any other grad level exam like the GRE, the GMAT, the MCAT, if you've ever looked at any of those. This is something completely different, and I think that logical reasoning really illustrates that more than any other section on the LSAT, because games are kind of mathematical in nature. They have some kind of loose relationships to Sudoku and reading comprehension. Although LSAT reading comp is different, you've seen SAT reading comp or ACT reading comp, or if you're from New York, you remember the Regents exams. We had exams like that throughout our entire careers. LSAT reading comp's a bit different, but on the surface it still does look the same. But logical reasoning, short, bite-sized arguments that actually relate extremely closely to what you'll be doing in law school in terms of IRAC, issue, rule, analysis, conclusion. Whenever I talk to anyone who does law school prep or bar exam prep, they're always reminding me of the parallels with the logical reasoning portion of the LSAT, where we're required to analyze complex arguments and figure out the points that they're trying to get across. So I think the logical reasoning, it's half the exam for a reason. It's half the exam because it helps the exam more strongly correlate with first-year law school grades, what you'll be doing. Now, a lot of times people debate the question stem first versus the stimulus first. What should you read first? And I think, honestly, it doesn't really matter which one you read first. People get all up in arms. Stem first is better. Stimulus first is better. There are plenty of top scorers on both sides of this debate, and I think that just goes to show it doesn't matter. Back when I was studying, I read stimulus first. Now I read question stem first, but I do find just the same. So I'll tell you why I like question stem first, but I'll leave it to you to decide in the end. So if we have the stimulus, which is a short, bite-sized argument that appears typically with a conclusion, it's an argument, or it could be a fact set, but either way, this is a paragraph where it's your job to analyze it. With the stimulus, you could either have a fact set or an argument. If you have a fact set, then you are most likely dealing with an inference question. This could be must be true, most strongly supported, conclusion, something requiring that you read between the lines, but there's no conclusion that they're looking to derive from this, no deductions to be making. So it must be true, most strongly supported, conclusion, etc. Something along those lines. Or it could be an argument. Now, if it's an argument, it could have either no gap, or it could have a gap. No gap never happens on the LSAT because that would be airtight logic. That would be like saying A requires B, B requires C, therefore A requires C. You can't strengthen that, you can't weaken it, it's airtight. And so for that reason, the LSAT will never include anything like that. Instead, you're going to have arguments with gaps. And this is the vast majority of the section, probably 85% to 90% of arguments on the LSAT contain a gap. Now you could ask, is it a small gap or is it a big gap? And the answer is, we don't know. There is no way to scientifically verify if it's small or big. It's really based on whether we consider the arguer to be reasonable or not. But what does reasonability mean, or reasonableness mean? I'm not sure of the grammar on that, but either way, it's in the eye of the beholder, and it's based on a standard that it's not in our place to judge. But the LSAT tells us how to judge whether it's small or big, and it's based on the question stem. If it's big, then you have a flaw question. If it's small, you might have necessary assumption. So it's based on whether we say the argument failed to consider something, or they just did not bother to explicitly state it. Now, of course, granted, there are classic logical fallacies, ad hominem personal attacks, correlation causation flaws. You could have a necessary sufficient confusion, many things within the flaw category. But even with something like a correlation causation flaw, is that they did not bother to consider the possibility of a third variable, or that the causality could be reversed, or that it's just a coincidence altogether, or they did not bother to explicitly state it because it's an underlying assumption. The question stem tells us either grant them the principle of generosity and say they just didn't bother to explicitly state it, and flaw question type says they're an idiot and they're making flawed logic that is vulnerable to criticism. So the question stem says view it as small or view it as big, or if it's must be true, most important conclusion, they're saying whether it's a fact set or an argument, either way, your job is not to point out gaps or flaws or holes in the argument. Your job is instead simply to say what the conclusion is or what else you can infer on the basis of the stimulus and the information given. Any questions on any of this? Just a general overview. Obviously, I have not listed every single question type here. In logical reasoning, there's maybe 14 or 15 types, depending on how you categorize them. But I think this framework where we're analyzing the stimulus is kind of useful just to get a sense of what really is going on within this section.